They would come in their billions, in clouds so huge they'd darken the sky. Every spring, for countless millennia, bogong moths would migrate up to the cooler alpine plains. Here, on a hill the shape of a moth, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people would gather to yarn, to collectively make decisions, to teach the young folk the songlines that held their culture together, and to feast on this fabulous, fatty delicacy. In the 1980s, against the strenuous objections of the traditional owners, that hill was excavated to build Australia's new Parliament House. The moths kept coming. The people who gathered there now, the parliamentarians and the journalists and lobbyists, found them kind of irritating. And when millions would cover windows and block vents, you'd often hear people in the corridors shouting, "Can't someone do something about them?" It went oddly unremarked then when, over several seasons, moth numbers plummeted. And for some years now, virtually no moths have arrived, either at Parliament or in the surrounding hills, or up in the high snowies. Scientists blame a combination of rising temperatures and less water from both agriculture and climate change for the population crash. Moths? He's going to get up and rabbit on about moths? Actually, what I really want to talk to you about today is what underlies that story. Change. Big, transformative change. I'm sure that pretty much every single one of you, like basically everyone I talk to, is looking at the world today and seeing a tremendous amount of change. Some of it good, some of it really exciting, parts of it kind of confronting, and some downright terrifying. Whether it be the climate crisis and species extinctions, or spiralling economic inequality and threats to our democracy here in Australia and around the world. In the face of this extraordinary change, it's easy to feel like a moth to the flame. Tiny, insignificant, powerless in the face of adversity. But what I hope to convince you of today is that starting by simply living our lives together better, we can transform our world for the better in a model I call living democracy, which follows the extraordinary ecological science of Panarchy. Panarchy is a new word. It gives us extraordinary insights from what's frankly kind of an obvious basic observation, which is that everything in the world goes through the same cycle of change. Growth, conservation, release, and reorganisation in some other form. Everything in the world, from the cells in our body to our bodies themselves, to the societies and ecosystems we live in, all the way through to stellar systems, goes through the same cycle of growth, conservation, release, and reorganisation. And at every scale, at every level, these cycles merge and interweave and intermesh in all sorts of ways that create tremendous stability, the equilibrium that characterises most of our lives most of the time. Because when one cycle is reaching release, another is in early stages of growth, and both are enmeshed in others which are sitting at conservation. But sometimes a whole lot of these cycles reach release at the same time. And that is a moment of tremendously swift transformation. A tipping point from one equilibrium into another, a moment of collapse and regeneration, when what happens next depends on what's growing underneath and what the conditions for growth are. To think about Panarchy a little bit more, let's go back to the bogong moth. When the populations crashed, it was kind of convenient for the people of Parliament House. For the local Indigenous people, it was yet another aspect of genocide, depriving them not only of food and culture, but in their worldview, literally a branch of their family tree. For the broader Snowy Mountains ecosystem, it could be the trigger for widespread collapse. Because the First Nations people weren't the only ones eating this beautiful delicacy. One of Australia's cutest animals, the mountain pygmy possum, or Burmese parvis, would emerge from hibernation just as the moths flew in. For an animal all of 11 centimetres long, if you don't count its 14-centimetre tail, a moth is a fantastic feast to help you put on enough weight to raise a family. But the Burmese was already endangered, thanks to habitat loss from logging, agriculture, ski resorts, and feral animals like horses and cats. When the moths didn't arrive, it spelt catastrophe. Extinction in the wild looms for this gorgeous creature, as it does for many other, perhaps less charismatic species of marsupial, reptile, and bird. At the same time, the stunning multicoloured snow gum, Eucalyptus pauciflora, that's so iconic of the high country, is suffering from a devastating dieback thanks to higher temperatures, more fire, less water, and a borer beetle that thrives in the warmer weather. It's a perfect storm for the snowies. Cycles of change as small as the lives of individual moths and possums, nested within the life cycle of trees, embedded within epochal shifts in availability of water and ambient temperature. What happens next depends on what's growing and what the conditions for growth are. On the current trajectory, the snowies could become a mountainous desert, with far fewer and more sparse species, until over time, new species of animal and plant take root and grow into a new ecosystem over time. In one part of the snowies, about halfway between Parliament and the highest peaks, that time frame has been condensed. At Severn Park, local farmer Charles Massey thought he was doing the right thing by the land using modern farming techniques, high levels of stocking, agricultural chemicals and fertilisers. But he began to see the land that he loved dying. And the ecological collapse was mirrored in financial collapse as the land became less productive, and emotional collapse for Massey. But he chose to take this crisis as a signal to change. Massey adopted regenerative farming techniques, using natural fertilisers and worms and compost to regenerate the soil. He planted a whole range of trees and bushes and shrubs to bring back birds like the reed warbler to help control the insects in the trees and the plants and the nematodes in the soil. With Massey's help, the self-organising magic of the natural world came to see his land become more abundant, more beautiful, more joyful, more healthy than it had been in generations. This is the lesson of Panarchy. In collapse is the moment of regeneration. What happens next depends on what's growing and what the conditions for growth are. And here's the thing. We humans have the extraordinary and unique capacity to influence what's growing, what's collapsing, and what the conditions for growth are. Let's bring this back to the climate crisis, to species extinction, to economic inequality and threats to our democracy. What does Panarchy tell us about how big change can happen? Well, I think it gives us a really interesting insight into what we're told are the only two ways in which big change can happen: reform and revolution. The thing about reform is that effectively it's tinkering around the edges of a system which we're coming to realise is at the point of release, and frankly, driving us towards the precipice. By making things a little bit less worse than they otherwise might be, reform releases the pressure valve. It enables this system, which is getting ready for release, to hold on a little bit longer than might be healthy. And at the same time, it suppresses the growth of the new that we need to transform into a better way of living together. So what this means is that when collapse comes, as it inevitably will, it could be worse than it otherwise might be, and the time taken for regeneration might be longer than it needs to be. Revolution is even worse, because revolution focuses primarily on destroying the old and far too little on building the new. It creates scorched earth by driving us apart. It means that we will be far less prepared for the new. It will make collapse worse, and in many cases, it drives regeneration and transformation in the wrong direction altogether. But what if there were another way? What if there were a panarchic approach to transformation that learns from how change happens in the natural world and the lessons from the extraordinary social changes that we've seen throughout history, but mostly have been unwritten? I've put together one model of this change that I call living democracy, which is a 4-step process. It starts by seeding the new, sowing the seeds of the new world that we want to live together. It extends by cultivating healthy soils, by ensuring that our seeds and those of others around us can grow more easily. It creates space for growth by weeding the ground, by explicitly and deliberately withdrawing our consent from the old ways of being, ways which depend on our consent for their existence. And by sowing seeds, cultivating the soils, weeding the ground, it creates a new system, a beautiful, new, flourishing, abundant, joyful ecosystem of living democracy. Is this really possible? Well, I'm here to tell you it's not only possible, it's happening all around us, all around the world, in all sorts of ways. Let me take you for a final trip around the world to Barcelona to see what's happened there over the course of the last decade. Now, Spain was one of the countries hardest hit by the global financial crisis. They had 25% unemployment rate, 50% youth unemployment. And thanks to their government's austerity policies, it was extraordinarily difficult for people to live. They couldn't afford to feed themselves and their families. They couldn't afford healthcare. They could barely afford to keep roofs over their heads. So millions of people poured onto the streets in protests that they called the Movement of the Squares. And through these protests, they did deliver some elements of political change. In Barcelona, they took a different approach. They took a much more transformative approach. In Barcelona, they started by helping each other. They started with mutual aid. Local farmers, community cooperatives, and restaurateurs came together to start food cooperatives so that they could ensure that everyone across the city had the food that they needed to survive and to feed their families. They started medical cooperatives so that those who could afford to could pay it forward to ensure that everybody else was able to get the care that they needed. They started squatters groups defending people who were being threatened with eviction and enabling to stay in their homes. And in all of these ways, they were helping people in their everyday lives, making people's lives better through their active participation, bringing communities together in beautiful, cohesive ways. But every step of the way, they were finding themselves thwarted by government. Government that saw its job primarily as protecting the interests of market, of business, over and above the interests of citizens and residents. So, these community groups came together again. These neighbours in mutual aid gathered around kitchen tables, gathered in community halls across the city, and they developed a political platform that they called Barcelona en Comú, Barcelona in Common. They ran for election and they won. And they've since been returned to to government with even greater numbers. Barcelona, since 2015, has now been governed in this extraordinary, transformative way. A city the size of Melbourne or Canberra, devolving power out of City Hall, down into the city streets, into the grassroots, in all sorts of ways. So communities are making their own decisions together about transport, about housing, about electricity and water and food supply and planning. This is an extraordinary example of panarchic transformation. They are sowing the seeds of change, living into being the world that they want to live in, a more regenerative, cooperative, abundant world. They're cultivating healthy soils by supporting others to replicate what they're doing in similar, maybe slightly different ways and connecting the dots, joining it up in all sorts of ways. They're explicitly weeding the ground, withdrawing consent from old ways of government that exclude most of us from decision-making most of the time, from old ways of economy that prioritise the market above people and communities and planet. And by sowing these seeds, cultivating the soils and withdrawing consent, they are creating a new political system, new infrastructure, new institutions of an abundant, joyful, cooperative, living democracy. And this isn't just happening in Barcelona. It's happening all around the world, everywhere around us. Here in Canberra, we're seeing the seeds of living democracy in our flourishing by nothing groups, in urban farms, in the way we're developing community renewable energy cooperatives, which we're also seeing down the road in Wangaratta with community energy cooperatives and other grassroots activities flourishing into an extraordinary development of community political independence. We're seeing it in Kurdistan, we're seeing it in London, and I've no doubt you all see it all around you, and every single one of you is involved in some way in the seeds of living democracy. Our task is to understand that we're not alone. None of us is the individual moth drawn inexorably to the flame. Neither are we actually just the cloud of moths. We're the moths and the possums and the trees and the waterways and the people and the songlines. We are an ecosystem. And when we understand ourselves to be an ecosystem that has the extraordinary capacity, responsibility, and privilege to influence what's collapsing, what's growing, and what the conditions for change are, we will be unstoppable.